son was 3 years old when he looked up at me and said, "Dad, what do I do?" We lived in Oakland, California. This was back in the 90s. My son is much older than 3 now. And I was getting ready to go to work. My oldest daughter and my oldest son had gone off to school. And Peter looked up at me and said, "Dad, what do I do?" And I looked around and I said, "Well, Peter, you got your blocks to play with here, and you got your little castle." And I started showing him some toys, and he just broke down and started sobbing in a mournful way that I had never heard him cry before. And he said, "You have work to go to, Catherine, and Nathan go to school. What do I do?" And I thought, man, this guy is wired to work. He's really, like, his identity was all wrapped up in what he was going to do. And he wanted something productive to do. And we're going to be in Genesis today, looking at themes of work and anger and competition. Last year, as I was going through Genesis, I was noticing all the sets of brothers that God shows us in the book of Genesis. We have Cain and Abel that we're going to look at today. We have Ishmael and Isaac. We have Jacob and Esau, and then we have Joseph and his brothers. Bill McDonald called Genesis the seedbed of Bible doctrines. The seedbed of Bible doctrines, because every doctrine in the Bible, every major doctrine is found in its seed form here in the book of Genesis. So it's a really good book. I want to read the book of Genesis once a year and the book of Revelation once a year, because it shows me where I've been, where I'm coming from, and where I'm going. And as we look at this story of Cain and Abel in chapter 4, we're going to look at themes of anger and identity and competition. So let's read together the first 16 verses of Genesis 4. Now the man had relations with his wife Eve, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain. And she said, "I have gotten a man-child with the help of the Lord." Again she gave birth to his brother Abel, and Abel was a keeper of flocks, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. So it came about in the course of time that Cain brought an offering to the Lord of the fruit of the ground. Abel, on his part, also brought the firstlings of his flock and of their fat portions, and the Lord had regard for Abel and for his offering, but for Cain and for his offering he had no regard. So Cain became very angry, and his countenance fell. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry, and why is your countenance fallen? If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must master it." Cain told his brother, and it came about, when they were in the field, that Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is Abel your brother?" And he said, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" He said, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. Now you are cursed from this ground, from the ground which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you cultivate the ground, it will no longer yield its strength to you. You will be a vagrant and a wanderer on the earth." Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is too great to bear. Behold, you have driven me this day from the face of the ground, and from your face I will be hidden, and I will be a vagrant and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." So the Lord said to him, "Therefore whoever kills Cain, vengeance will be taken on him sevenfold." And the Lord appointed a sign for Cain, so that no one finding him would slay him. Then Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. So we see in this passage the first mention of anger. We see the first murder in the Bible, and we see the first mention of the word sin. a lot of things happening here. So this is part of a series of 4 messages called From Conflict to Contentment. But we're really looking at conflict here. And as I said, identity and anger. And so it's good to note 2 things right from the outset. First of all, Cain was the oldest, right? So Cain, it's the oldest, feels kind of responsibility for the family in these. Apparently he and Abel were together, and then their jobs are really important. Their jobs, because their jobs are related to their sacrifices later on. Cain was a tiller of the ground. He grew crops, and his brother Abel worked with animal agriculture. But before we get into that, I just want to clarify, I think it's a misconception that I read in just about every Sunday school lesson on Cain and Abel, and I'm going to explain why this is kind of important, I think. I don't believe that Cain and Abel were the first sons of Adam and Eve. And I'll tell you why I don't believe that. If we go to Genesis 5:3, it's talking about, so Abel had died and they had a substitute, right? They wanted a son to replace Abel, and his name was Seth. So this is important. Genesis 5:3 says, when Adam had lived 130 years, he became the father of a son in his own likeness, according to his image, and he named him Seth. Did you get that? 130 years before Seth came along, right? If we think of Cain and Abel just as being in their 20s, say, or in their late teens, they have their careers established, and when Abel dies, Eve has a son a year or 2 later, and that's Seth to replace Abel. So I don't think they waited 100 years to have their honeymoon, right? Adam and Eve to have Cain and Abel. But it says they were 130 years old when they had Seth, right? So Adam and Eve were perfect adults, ready to procreate when they were created. Doesn't make sense that they would wait that long to have kids if Cain and Abel were their first kids. And we see Cain goes out into the world. He's afraid of being murdered. He wouldn't be afraid of being murdered if he was the first kid out there, right? So the reason I think this is important is because a lot of people, this is on the internet, it's in movies, people start reading the Bible, they think Cain and Abel are the first kids, and then they say, so who was Cain's wife? All right? Well, if Adam and Eve were like 100, 110 when they had Cain and Abel, they had like 100 years to procreate, and kids in agricultural societies, it's not uncommon to have kids when you're like 14, 15 years old. So you've easily got, if you do the math, you've easily got like 1,000 people on the earth by the time Cain and Abel are here 130 years later, 100 years later. And so I'm just mentioning that because our kids grow up and they hear these questions and they read them on the internet or they see them on a movie, and they don't say it, but it stays with them. Questions bug us that we don't resolve with the Bible. And then if enough questions that are unresolved are just kind of boiling out there in there and they're afraid to ask, something happens and they leave the church and they leave their faith. So I think we should address questions as they come up. That's why I think that's important. But let's go back to Cain and Abel and their jobs. Abel, a keeper of the flocks. Cain, a tiller of the ground. These 2 men were involved in their jobs. And we see in the beginning that Adam was given a job to do. He was given a job to do, and he was given a helpmate. And Eve was given the ability to have kids. So those are both important parts of their identity. And they continue to be important parts of our identity today. When men meet each other, one of the first questions we ask is, what do you do? What do you do? And what we're really asking is, who are you? Right? What's your identity? And God added an important aspect to work in chapter 3 of Genesis and to a woman's ability to bear children. And I'm just going to read, this is after the fall, after Adam and Eve had sinned. I'm just going to read something that people think of as a curse, but I really think it's a blessing to help us draw near to God. So I'll read verse 17 in chapter 3 of Genesis. Then to Adam he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree about which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat from it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you will eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it shall grow for you, and you will eat the plants of the field by the sweat of your face. You will eat bread till you return to the ground, because from it you were taken. For you are dust, and to dust you shall return. So we see that as a result of the curse of the fall, as a result of the fall, God knew that the work could be an idol for people, for men, right? And that for women, kids could be an idol. And so he wanted to cause problems in those areas so that people would cry out to God and not make idols of those things. And so that when men went to work, they wouldn't make an idol out of their work, but they would like, oh, look at these thorns. Lord, I need help. Help me, right? Help me with this. And when women had kids, it'd be like, oh, I'm having this morning, evening, afternoon sickness, and it's awful, and help me, Lord. And I know a number of women who have been saved through childbirth in the sense that they cried out to God because it was such a hard experience. And men who came to the end of themselves in work and they cried out to God. So these are important things, pain in childbirth and thorns and thistles in your work, because they help us to see I can't do this and I need God. Thorns and thistles were very closely related to my work. I was an agricultural biologist for Alameda County for a number of years when Peter asked me, what he was going to do. And I was part of the rodent and weed division, and obviously, what do you think our biggest weeds are in our counties? They're thorns and thistles, right? And one of the weeds that we'd go out to the ranches and spray were wild artichoke thistles. And these thistles can become really high. And so what we would do, we'd go out with our backpack sprayers, and we'd take the wand from our sprayer and we'd hit the stalk, and it would knock the seed head down, and then we'd spray into the wound because the plant absorbs the herbicide that way. And one of my buddies was working one day. He's kind of short, and these plants are pretty tall, and he was bald. And he knocks the stalk with his wand, and the artichoke comes right down on his head. And it's full of these big thorns. And so they had to pull the thorns out of his bald scalp, So it's a deal. It's a real thing. These thorns and thistles, they're really a problem. I can relate. And Cain and Abel had to deal with this. And they realized at some point that they should offer a sacrifice to God. They should offer an offering to God. And their offerings, it makes sense that their offerings were related to their jobs, right? Cain offered something out of the ground, and Abel offered an animal sacrifice. But the interesting thing here is that Abel's was accepted, or God had regard for it, means God gazed with favor on Abel's sacrifice, but he didn't gaze on favor with Cain's sacrifice. And so Hebrews tells us what the real lesson that both Cain and Abel should have gotten out of this experience is, and that's in Hebrews 11, verse 4. It says, by faith, Abel offered to God a better sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained the testimony that he was righteous, God testifying about his gifts, and through faith, though he is dead, he still speaks. So Abel the fact that Abel by faith offered a sacrifice implies to me that there must have been some instruction given about sacrifice, offer a sacrifice to God. God must have told him something. It doesn't say in Genesis what he told them. It doesn't say if he talked to Adam and Eve and they talked to their sons. It doesn't say if he gave the instructions both to Cain and Abel. And Cain was like, well, I don't have any goats, so I'm going to offer some corn. It doesn't say, so we don't know. But it seems that there was some instruction given, and by faith, Abel followed that instruction. And what Hebrews is about, it's all about the better sacrifice. It's all about the Lord Jesus. He is the better sacrifice. He's the better high priest. He has the better covenant. And Genesis is trying to teach us about the better sacrifice, that there's an animal sacrifice required. For Adam and Eve, when they sin, God kills an animal to provide skins, right? Here, an animal needs to be slaughtered. Blood needs to flow for God to have favor. Later on, Abraham is going to be asked, Noah is required to offer a sacrifice after the flood out of the animals from the ark. Then he was told to designate certain animals for sacrifices. And he offered those. The first thing he did after he got off the ark. And it was a pleasing aroma to God. Later on, Abraham is asked to sacrifice his son. And God instead provides a ram with the promise of a lamb that's going to come. So Genesis is all about the better sacrifice. And of course, that's fulfilled in the Lord Jesus. And Cain didn't get it. He didn't get that lesson. He didn't get that lesson of the need for an animal sacrifice. Because his identity, I believe, was so wrapped up in his work that when his sacrifice was rejected, it was like a rejection of his work and a rejection of himself. Instead of, it's not about your work, it's not even about you, Cain, it's about the sacrifice. And you can offer the sacrifice I'm looking for. So the results were that Cain became very angry, the end of verse 5. And here's the first mention of anger and the first mention of sin. And his countenance fell. And this is where our first lesson today comes. Is when your identity is in anything besides Jesus, you're going to get angry. When our identity is in anything besides Jesus, we're going to become angry. Because what God has for us is the Lord Jesus. He is the better sacrifice. And when we put our identity in our jobs, like Cain, or our kids, like we find out later with Hagar and Sarah, or in anything besides Jesus, we're going to become angry. And there's a verse that really helped me when I was in Nicaragua that you're not going to find if you do a word study on anger. You're not going to find this verse because the word anger is not in there. But if you just look with me to James 4, 1 and 2. James 4, 1 and 2 says, "What is the source of quarrels and conflict among you?" So that sounds like anger, doesn't it? Right? Quarrels and conflict. "Is not the source your pleasures that wage war on your members? You lust and do not have, so you commit murder. You are envious and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel." See, when we're looking outside of Jesus for our satisfaction, whether in our identity, we have expectations, right? And James is saying your expectations don't get met, and so you get angry, right? And you fight and quarrel and you murder. And you lust and do not have, so you commit murder, and you're envious and cannot obtain. See, when I put my expectations on anything outside of Jesus, it often fails, right? I have expectations at work. Some's supposed to go a certain way, and then all of a sudden there's a delay, and now I have to go to Home Depot, and I wasn't expecting that, and then something else happens, and now I'm angry, right? Because my expectations didn't happen. Things didn't happen the way I wanted to go. And this goes back to the garden. What's the lie of Satan? You will become like gods. When we pretend that we can control anything, we're acting like gods. And then we're angry because we can't control anything. I can't even control where my next breath is coming from. I cannot control anything. But when I have expectations about anything, I'm acting like a god. I'm acting like I'm the one in control. And then I get angry. And that's what happened to Cain. He thought from his crops the sacrifice would work and he, would be accepted. And he wasn't. And so he got angry. When we expect things to go a certain way with our jobs or a relationship or our spouse or our kids, and they don't go that way, we become angry. Because circumstances change, but Jesus doesn't change. Jesus is the same yesterday, today, yes, and forever. He is the sacrifice. The sacrifice doesn't change. He doesn't change. And so he is the perfect source of our identity. We can go to him, and he becomes our righteousness. It wasn't Abel's righteousness that saved him. It was the righteousness of the sacrifice that he offered by faith. But Cain didn't see it, that it was about the sacrifice. So he kept on blaming Abel for everything bad that happened. We also have the idea of competition, even though it's not named. It comes in here, and it comes in with all of the relationships with brothers that we see in the book of Genesis. If Abel's sacrifice wasn't accepted, I really don't think Cain would have been angry, right? Because it's like, oh, we both lost, whatever, But because they were close in age and they were obviously had close relationship together, when Abel succeeded and Cain saw his failure, that's when he became angry. Angry enough to kill. And again, just like work is a good thing, but when we make an idol of it, it becomes a bad thing. Competition is a good thing. It helps me be better, right? When I was a runner, I didn't think I could run 4 miles, but when my team did it, I did it with them, and all of a sudden we could run 4, we could run 6, we could run 10 miles, and that's what we did. I wouldn't do that myself. So competition is good, but when we make an idol of it, when we put our identity in our competition about I have to do better than so-and-so in my grades or my athletics or whatever, then that's when it becomes bad. It becomes an idol. It comes naturally to brothers. We have 2 sons that are 17 months apart, close in age. They grew up together, best friends, but also competitive, right? When they had similar interests, they wanted to see if they could do better than their brother. And I remember they were both at one point interested in flying. And Nathan, I remember him telling me, I remember the moment that I had to give up flying to Peter because I couldn't keep up with him. Which was good because Peter became a pilot, so it was just as well. But they had things that they kind of raced each other in. But competition becomes evil when our identity is based on competition. Kids become a problem when your identity is wrapped up in your kids. It's not good for your kids, it's not good for you. There's a problem when your marriage or your job comes before God. That's what an idol is. So now we see what God does to help Cain in verses 6 and 7. And he asks questions. And this is lesson number 2, is listen to God's questions. God doesn't ask questions because he needs answers. He doesn't ask questions because he lacks information. He asks questions to help us think, to make us think about the problem and the roots of the problem. The beautiful questions that he asked Adam right after the fall, remember the first one? Where are you, Adam? Because his GPS wasn't working, he didn't know where Adam was? No, he knows where Adam was, but he's wanting Adam to realize, hey, I'm not with you, am I, God? I've run away. There's a problem. I've distanced myself from you, and now you're asking me where I am, and I'm realizing that I should be with you, and I'm not, and that's a problem. And he asks Adam, have you eaten from the tree of which I commanded you not to eat? What did he want Adam to do? Confess his sin. Yes, I disobeyed you, God. I just realized that. I was caught up in the circumstances. But instead, Adam, well, it was the woman you gave me, right? It was really my fault. And what are the questions that he asks to Cain? They're very good questions that we should ask ourselves. Why are you angry? Whenever you're angry, that's a good question to ask yourself. Why am I angry? If Cain had been honest, he would have said, I'm angry because my identity is wrapped up in my work and you rejected my work. That's why I'm angry, God. And then he asks, why has your countenance fallen, right? Our anger affects how we look at everything else. It affects our behavior. It affects our posture. So does anxiety. Why are you anxious? Why are you angry? And I found it's a very good thing for me to ask that back to God. God, why am I angry? Help me think through that. We get angry for different reasons. I've talked about where our identity is. We get angry. I get angry if my weakness is exposed, right? Because my insecurities are come right to the forefront. One of my weaknesses is I'm not very organized. I was a little embarrassed because I forgot that in this chapel showing, my office would be shown, and my stuff's just kind of a mess in my office. But that's just, one of my weaknesses. And I remember once I taught a 4th grade geography class, and it's my first day, and I'm pretty nervous because I've never taught 4th graders anything. And I've got all these handouts, and I'm trying to hand them all out, and this 4th grader looks up at me and she goes, "You're not very organized, are you?" And I just wanted to slap her, because he just came, he just exposed me in front of everyone. But I just said, "You're right, I'm not." And we became good friends. So, why am I angry? Why am I angry? And God, can you help me figure out why I'm angry? Because then I can bring it to you, and then I can confess, I've been acting like I'm in control of this situation, and I have no control, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry for taking control from you. I give it back to you. I give my marriage back to you. I give my job back to you. I give my work at church back to you. It's not mine, it's yours. Don't let your job define you. Don't let your kids define you. Don't let anything except for Jesus Christ define you, because he is the answer to our needs. He is the better sacrifice. And when we come to him, everything that we have and that we need is in him. And we can say, I'm a follower of Jesus, and that's enough. That's everything. God says, remember Jesus to Peter? Peter was pretty wrapped up in his word, wasn't he? He's a fisherman. So Peter, what do? I'm a fisherman. You good at it? Yeah, I think he would say, yeah, I'm a good fisherman. But what did Jesus say? You're not going to be fishing for fish anymore, Peter. You're going to be fishing for men. You're mine now. Follow me. I'll make you a fisher of men. I define your job. I define who you are because your identity is in me. What would Cain have needed to do well? Because God says to him, if you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? Like, there's a way out of this, Cain. There's a way out of your anger right now. I'm right here talking to you. I can help you. And if Cain had thought about it, if he had thought about the sacrifice, he could have just traded some corn for a yearling of Abel's, and he could have offered a good sacrifice, and God would have looked well upon his sacrifice. Because that was the lesson. It was about the sacrifice. And so, here's where sin is mentioned for the first time in the Bible, in verse 7. Sin is crouching at the door, and you must master it. There is a way out of anger. There's a way out of sin. But it's not in me. It's in God, and it's in his sacrifice. Anger is crouching out at the door. A lot of you are angry, and you don't even know it. Like, we come home from work, and we've had a great day at work, and it's just something happens, and we just like, boom, what's wrong? And all of a sudden, like, why am I so angry? Because I was expecting something at home. It didn't happen, right? Why am I so angry? Anger is crouching at the door, but you must master it. There's a way out. There's a way out. Identify the reason for your anger and come to the better sacrifice. It wasn't about Cain. It was about the sacrifice. It's not about us. It's about God and what he's done. So, first lesson, whenever our identity is in anything besides Jesus, we're going to become angry. Second, listen to God's questions. Third, anger leads to murder. It says, if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door and its desire is for you. And its desire got Cain. He didn't check his anger. He didn't take it to God. He just got more and more angry, and it resulted in the first murder. Anger leads to murder. Jesus said, you've heard the ancients were told, you shall not commit murder. But I say to you, everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. Murder begins with anger. Murder begins when we have expectations of other people and we didn't take them to God. That's where murder begins. And that's why we need to just confess it and say, wow, it's there again. I didn't even see it, but Colossians 3:15, let the peace of Christ rule your heart. Anger just blocks that peace right away. And you can say, wow, there it is again, Lord. Where did that come from? I'm sorry. This lesson came to me very early on in my life. I was walking home from kindergarten with my friend Jack Cook and a girl, I don't remember who she was. And we were just kind of playing around, and we were walking in single file on this little wall. It was just about this high. There's grass, not a dangerous situation. But Jack pushed me, and my anger just flared up, and I pushed him back, and he fell off the wall. Well, he fell on the grass. No big deal, right? But he's holding his stomach, and we're like, are you okay? And he's like, I can't breathe. And like, when you're 5, 6 years old, you don't know about the wind being knocked out of you, but that's what happens to Jack, and that's what we just say, oh, we got the wind knocked out. But all I'm thinking of is, I pushed my friend off the wall, and if he doesn't start breathing, he's going to die, and I'm guilty of murder. At some level, I am guilty of murder. I have just murdered my friend out of anger. That was right there. My whole life was like over. And then Jack started to breathe. It was all good, right? But I realized, wow, my anger could result in murder, and it will if it's not checked. So God's response to Cain was to become a wanderer on the earth, and he put a mark to protect him from being murdered. And we see the fullness of Cain's anger in his descendant Lamech, or Lamech, I'm not sure how you pronounce his name. And so you run down to verse 23, and you've got Lamech, this descendant of Cain. He's boasting to his wives, and he says, Ada and Zillah, listen to my voice, you wives of Lamech. Give heed to my speech, for I have killed a man for wounding me, and a boy for striking me. If Cain is avenged sevenfold, then Lamech 77-fold. So you see the fullness of anger. If it's not stopped by the sacrifice, it just gets worse and worse, and it results in murder 77-fold. And we think of Jesus' answer to that when Peter asks him, how many times should I forgive my brother, right? 7 times. And Jesus says, 70 times 7. My grace trumps anger. My forgiveness trumps anger. And we can have victory over anger in Christ's forgiveness. So what are you angry about? Why are you angry? Ask God that question. And then turn to the sacrifice and turn to the forgiveness that's offered.